Let's look at Stonewall Sword. Interesting story with this one. It's a Revolution Games. This was sent to me by a viewer. He had a spare copy and really wanted to see some exposure for Revolution Games. So it's sort of like a review copy, but not one being presented. You know, it wasn't given to me by the company. I've met the I guess publisher of Revolution Games and get along well with him, and he enjoys my videos, but he's never sent me anything. I think he's kind of afraid to, honestly. And I always correlated that with the couple games that I've played with him from the company, and kind of looked at it and said, you know, these are a little lighter than I tend to like, and, you know, he's probably right not to submit them, you know, for me to look at, because unlike, say, Marco, I tend to not take as much pleasure and not get as much out of them. This one looks a little different, though, so at least a little different from what my impression is. Maybe a lot of their games are different. This is going to cover Cedar Mountain. Now, if you recall, we played, or I played Cedar Mountain on video, the old SPI one. It's part of the second version of the Great Battles of the American Civil War. And that's sort of your standard brigade level, well, regimental level counters. And you have that here too, but where you have different firing weapon types, and you have to correspond the range to the type of weapon. See how much firepower you have, roll on a chart, see how much damage there is, make morale checks, this, that, and the other. This is trying to abstract that a little bit, but it also doesn't look like it's a simplistic version of it. This is no Napoleon at Waterloo. I've tried to work my way through the rules, and you know me, if you watch my videos, sometimes I struggle with them. And I've read these. They haven't sunk in completely because there are some new systems to this design as a whole. Now, like the last thing I covered, this is apparently the kickoff of what could be a whole series of new games and of American Civil War and maybe similar era tactical games. The designer is a name I recognize, but I can't remember it. I don't want to say Lutman, but I don't want to be wrong. Yeah, Herman Lutman. And I've heard the name. I've seen him associated with other things. I don't know. I don't think I've played anything of his before. And this is an interesting take. So let's take a look at how it's going to work. First thing is, and this I think is brilliant, the cover sheet. You know, this is basically a folio. It's going to be, you know, it's going to go in with my magazine games, which always has its advantages and disadvantages. Advantages in storing, disadvantages in that it's not on my shelf, so it's not easy for me to look at and say, oh yeah, I haven't played that in a while. So I kind of, unless it's, you know, one of my few old classics that are really on my mind, it probably won't stick in my head quite as well. But on the other side of it, they've got the turn record track and some other information on here that is of use. Okay. So in the game, they have different altitudes for different for the terrain, and that's important because this is particularly hilly terrain, Cedar Mountain. I think kind of the lightest, well, see, up here is the highest terrain, and then we work our way down, and we get down into here, and it's kind of hard to tell, but it looks like the darker the terrain is, the darker green, that's going to be the lower terrains. And they kind of explain it here without a map key particularly. Terrain features, they fill the whole hex, even if they're not kind of drawn to do so, but obviously not little things like this little overage here. That's a clear hex. Different kinds of water terrain. There's dry stream, flowing stream, and pond, and I really don't think there's any kind of imagery. Oh, here we go. Cool, there is a map key. All right, so we have different terrains here that are going to be covered. flowing stream is going to be the blue. Ponds will be wider. Things, let's see, there's one up here, probably impassable. And I'm trying to see the dry stream, but I'm not seeing that at all on here, which is going to be kind of troublesome for me. Your specific combat counters, you have, like I said, basically regimental level units, and those have two values, a strength value and a cohesion value. And then on the flip side is what they call battle worn. It's basically a more damaged unit. You have to handle that a little carefully with the optional rules. A couple of special markers, the skirmish order. Facing doesn't matter, but you know, I'm so used to facing in tactical games that I just couldn't help myself. I may end up rotating everything so that I can see the numbers more easily. This is a particularly interesting battle because Stonewall was in one of his least effective states. He spent much of the battle sleeping, and it just did not give adequate orders. I believe Hill, I think Jackson ended up arresting Hill during this battle, but I think Hill actually kind of saved the day. I don't remember, maybe it wasn't Hill who got arrested, but somehow I think so. But he's coming in very late. So his troops are all these reinforcements, and some of his troops aren't even going to show up unless you're playing with the options. Maybe it was a Yule he had arrested. So, do we have a terrain effects chart on here that tells us anything for movement? We do. So we have your standard kind of terrain effects chart. It's broken up into the different types of units. There's only one cavalry unit in the game. It's a Union Cav here, and it's going to have some special rules to go with it, which kind of make... It's got its own little rules here, and it's kind of going to shake up the idea of series. Like, there is no series rule book here yet, and so the individual rule on that cavalry unit is very clearly designed for this one battle, and things might change in other battles. Anyway, you have them by the different types of terrain cross-reference with the different types of unit, and then you have the LOS effect, which we'll talk about because that gets a little more complicated than usual. Stacking is going to be 8 strength points or 1 unit, whichever is larger. And you have reduction, you have special cases here. So for example, artillery count, every 2 strength points of artillery only counts as 1 strength point for stacking limitations. This using lanes and pikes and march column is basically you can't march through a bigger force that's on the roads, so, and still use the road movement. We got our sequence of play written here, which we'll touch on, or we'll go into in some detail in a little bit. There is angled terrain graphic, and they tell us an example here, 1302, which is up here, I guess. Now let's see what the distinguishing feature of that is. Where does it tell us? Angled terrain. I saw it. There it is. It looks like it may be the lines with the slope built in. I'm not sure. But they're very steep and difficult to traverse, and they have a special penalty. Artillery can't do fire combat from them. Slopes are going to be any 1 level change. I guess is the down and up slope here. Anytime you can see that there's a level change, I guess it's a slope. What's strange here is that some hex sides change level elevation but do not have a slope hex side. Well, it looks like the slope is actually indicated with a bit of a line. And this is going to be hard to tell. Hey, you know, is this a slope? Is it a steep slope? Which looks kind of maybe this more ragged or more darkly printed stuff. And then the angled is, I guess, with these lines, because angled is actually a hex. The steep slopes are going to have a 2-level change in elevation discernible on them. And that's not clear to me, but here it looks like maybe this is 2 levels because this level's in between. And there is a little bit of a different graphic there. So we'll try to catch those as best we can. I have to say the graphical presentation here, first of all, it has kind of a childish look to it, as though somebody kind of did it with a colored pencil. And then add to that, it really isn't well presented in terms of, hey, here's what you have. When things are written out like this, when the terrain key is not entirely clear just by looking at it, that's going to cause some difficulties, I think. Okay. So our strength points for a unit are going to be basically how many men there are in it. And I don't know what they talked about, 100, 150 men per strength point. Might depend on the type of thing. Units also have a weapon type listed on them. So for example, these guys have a rifle. These guys have a smoothbore musket. You also have R's and S's on your artillery to distinguish between rifled and smoothbore artillery. And then there's some MX artillery, which is, of course, multi-launch capability. No. And then I don't know what this is. SR. Oh, God. Did not keep its focus. SR is sharp carbines. Okay. Infantry that have smoothbore muskets have special rules. They're not going to have a long-range fire combat. They go from effective to extreme, and that'll be handled on the combat table. So we have a number of different charts here. We have a chart with the weapons ranges, and we do have a breakdown of different weapons types to ranges, and then we have some column shifts based on the type of weaponry instead of the multipliers that maybe you're used to with the GB, ACW, or other systems, CWB, for example. And then the combat table itself is going to be an effectiveness reduction. Remember, you have sort of a step loss. Well, instead of strength point markers or anything like that to track all that, you just have kind of a step loss type system. So it's somewhere in between in terms of the amount of fiddly type stuff, but the charts contain a lot of that, and I think until you get very familiar with the charts, it's going to be as expensive to play in terms of mental and mechanical aspects as the supposedly more detailed games. I think this is trying to capture the same level of detail with a little bit different flavor of how it goes about doing it. And obviously it's not going to capture all of it because it's not going to capture individual strength point losses and stuff like that. So the units also have a cohesion rating, and the higher that is, the better it's going to be. That's going to be sort of like your morale rating in other games, and we'll see how that takes effect. When a unit's broken, it's a little weaker in both values. And big counters and my fingers seem to not go well together. Okay. We also have these, which are going to be brigade activation counters. As we use brigades, we mark them off as activated, and that'll indicate that you can't move it again. This is going to be a chit pull game, but you don't throw these suckers in the chit pull. You actually throw the overall commanders in the chit pull. What are the values on those overall commanders? Let's see if there's any indication. Okay, there's no indication of what their value is, so we'll have to hit that a little bit later. Okay, that's going to be their command rating, which I don't know what the effects of that are. I don't remember that. But it's not something normal. Then you have casualty. These are basically replacements for the other leaders. So if Banks takes a wound or is killed, he'll get replaced with this. Now, if the replacement leader takes a wound, he actually gets replaced with the original leader, which is like either the original leader is well now or some more competent replacement has taken place. I find that a little funky, but okay. You're going to need a cup, which I of course will have, to keep the chits, because this does use a chit pull mechanism of a sort. Actually, I believe in with the regular chits, you're going to throw the random event chits. And these are kind of interesting because they're not truly random events. They're event chits that one side or the other gets to play if they come up. And you get some selection capability with them. We're going to need a couple of 6-sided dice, and we're going to need different colors because, as you can see, the die roll uses an 11 to 66 chart, at least for the combat table. In other places it looks like we're using different colored dice for different things as well there. So I'll find them. There's a general rounding rule, which is you add everything up, you do all the arithmetic, and then you drop fractions at the end of all calculations, which is pretty cool to have that spelled out, I guess. Artillery and cavalry are going to be independent units, and they have their own specified activation phase where that takes place. And we can see here we have this artillery phase. So what's going to happen is the players choose basically a random event that they want to throw in the cup, guaranteed that's going to happen. Then 2 get pulled out that they're not going to get on any given turn, and the rest go in. So they get 1 that they can guarantee goes in, and then there's 2 that are put aside that they don't know what they are, and the rest go in from each player. Then you're going to have each player in turn take an artillery step where they get to move or fire their artillery. And this is actually when the Union Cav gets to operate as well, which is kind of weird. It doesn't operate in with the other small arms units. And this is done in an alternating fashion. You do one artillery piece, then the other guy does an artillery piece, then you do one, and the other guy does one, blah, blah, blah. I think if you pass, you're out forever. Then we go to chit draw, and if you have a held event chit, you're allowed to play it. Otherwise, somebody draws a chit, and if it's an event chit, the owning player gets to keep it. If it's a wild chit, there's 2 of those, the Fortunes of War and Fog of War, that don't necessarily, they're not under either player's control. And they're going to cause a random roll on, say, the Fog of War table. And then there's also, I think, a table for Fortunes of War somewhere. Maybe it's not a table. I don't see a table, but there's some random factor to what Fortunes of War does as well. Okay. Okay. Units are going to be organized. The actual units on the board are regiments. They're going to be organized into brigades. And essentially, when you draw a leader chit, you get to activate one of the brigades. You flip over the brigade leader, you do your activation with that brigade, and then that brigade's not eligible for another activation. But if any brigades are still eligible, the chit goes back in the cup. So you have a bit more leeway than in a lot of chit pull games in terms of, oh hey, I got, someone from Augur's division, I get to choose which brigade I want to activate on this activation. That should be kind of interesting. It gives you sort of an in-between the sort of pure randomness of a chit pull game and, well, something that like a purely pulsed game where you I'm looking for Korean Noir, Victory Games Korean Noir up here, which allows you to pretty much select the units you want to play. You use them, and then they're used up, and then the other guy gets to select whatever. Now, in this, it's sort of in between. You draw the chit, you get to activate a particular division, and you get to activate just one brigade within that division. The Commander-in-Chief is sort of a wild chit. He'll allow you to activate any brigade for an extra move. Now, at the beginning of the game, Jackson is the Commander-in-Chief for the Confederates, and he kind of doesn't have an activation available. When you do an activation, you have to make a die roll, and we'll get to that in a moment because I don't remember the exact factor of that. Artillery have special restrictions in the woods. They basically can't move through the woods. If they are allowed to portage around a blocked road hex side, though, at additional cost. But other than that, your artillery can only move through the woods on roads. Oversized units are considered stacking points. If you end up overstacked unintentionally, like because your unit's rallying or whatever, you have to overstack it. You don't get hurt too badly by it. Okay. So we talked about this. The artillery stage, like I said, you get to choose whether to move or fire with your artillery each time you move. The Union Cav has its special rules, and here's where I'm talking about. You know, these are not, you can't boilerplate these, make these into a standard set of rules for a system when you've got a piece like the Union Cav unit, the 1st Pennsylvania. But hey, in today's day of easy word processor and typesetting situations, that may not be that big a deal to include game-specific stuff right in the midst of a system game. Not that the rest of the system exists in a printed format yet. So the Cav would be conducting fire combat first, then it gets to move, then it does close combat. And that's going to be a general pattern for the units. They do fire combat, movement, close combat. That's important because that's how you get rid of one of the kind of burdens of the other systems that I've seen at this level, which is, oh look, first we have a defensive fire phase, then we have movement, then we have defensive fire, then we have offensive fire. Well, we can cut that out by giving and this was a clever move, by putting the fire before the movement phase. So your units fire before they close, then they close on the defending units, and they don't get to fire. They do get to close combat though, and there's a defensive fire aspect to that, which adds as much. But it does get rid of some of the die rolling. So instead of rolling, 2 fire per player turn action, which wouldn't really be easy in a pulsed game anyway, what you have instead is, hey, if your opponent is far away from you and you want to close with him, you're not going to get your effective fire off until after perhaps he has a chance to do so. Now there's a possibility that you might be able to kind of get a jump on him through the chip bowls, but it's only that, a possibility. All right. So before a new chit is drawn, either player can play one of their event or commander-in-chief chits that they've got set aside, that they've already drawn from the cup. And that can kind of trump what's going on. The random event, which are spelled out on the particular player aids, will be present there. And I'm going to have to spend some time kind of zoning out on those before I start the play. Then somebody picks a chit, and if it's an event chit, so there's a couple ways you can do this because these have 2 sides to them. One is if you're playing with event chits being hidden from the opponent, you're going to have to draw them and kind of feel the back side of the chit and not look at the front side of the chit. And then when you look at the back side, you can see, oh, send a courier to General Pope. That's the generic event that every single Union event chit has on it. The Confederate event chits have Wake Up Jackson or Go Find Jackson on the back of them. But the front side of them have specific events, and you would have to be careful not to look at the specific event. Now, the rules say, well, if you're playing with this and somebody accidentally sees an event, hey, so what, you know? It's spies or whatever, and that's cool, but I could see you might not want to play that way if you're playing in an incredibly competitive environment. So then the player whose event it is gets to look at it, and they get to decide one of two things. If they're playing the basic game, they just put the event aside, and they'll get to play it later before the next draw, or before any given draw. If you're playing with some of the more advanced rules, you could send a courier to General Pope. You could use the generic event, and I will be playing with those, of course. I'll be playing with all the chrome that I can add on to a game always. If one of the wild chits comes up, you roll it and you take its event in play. Now, I'm not sure if both of them take a die roll. If a commander-in-chief chit is drawn, the owning player immediately selects a brigade to activate, or he can hold the chit like an event for later use in the sort of trumping it. Finally, if a divisional activation is drawn, the player chooses one of the brigades that has not yet been activated from that division and does so. Now, he can choose either a full activation or a limited activation. Well, he doesn't choose it. He rolls a die, and that's going to be based on the command rating of the leader. If it ends up being a limited activation, he's not going to have as aggressive a set of options available to him. The event chits, as I said, are spelled out over here. The unique part of them. The common events are only used if you're playing with the optional rules. The wild chits, okay, Fortunes of War. This is why there's no chart for that. Fortunes of War says the next chit drawn is discarded. It has no effect. If it's a divisional activation chit, the player has to select an eligible brigade and mark it as activated without doing anything. You can't even do a limited activation. At least you get to pick which one of your brigades gets screwed, though, right? The Fog of War, on the other hand, is going to be rolling on a little chart, and you're going to get an effect which might include your opponent moving your pieces. It might also include a casualty. And we'll look into those in more detail during play itself. But I kind of like the idea of the opposing player picking something and actually helping you move it. That's one of the things I always liked about the CWB system. The Commander-in-Chief chit, when you draw this, and Jackson is not in the game at the beginning, allows you to activate a brigade. This will normally be a full activation, but if the commander's been wounded, he might have an activation rating and has to roll against that. When you do a divisional activation, if you roll less than or equal to the command rating, you can do a full activation. You select a brigade belonging to the drawn division, and that'll be allowed to go through brigade activation. If you roll greater than the command rating, all you get is a limited activation, which means that units in the brigade that are adjacent to the enemy may issue fire combat normally, but no other units in the brigade may perform any actions whatsoever during the activation. You can fire some defensive fire against things that you're adjacent to, and that's it. When a chit needs to be discarded, you put it aside. No biggie there. And when a division's done, its divisional activation, when all its brigades are done, can be put aside because it can't have an effect in the cup. And when the cup's done, I think the turn is over. All right, we're going to take a pause here because we need battery switch. There's annoying music outside, and my breath is running out. Okay. So, when you activate a brigade, you have to give it orders. Orders aren't like in some other games. It's just a limitation on what you do with that brigade during that activation. They aren't going to carry over. You have a number of different orders. Attack allows you to assault the enemy. Your movement allowance is going to be 4 movement points. It's going to change by orders. You can engage, which means you can move up against them. And you can do any kind of combat, but you can't rally. Defend gives you only 2 movement points. You can engage enemy units, but only conduct fire combat, no close combat. And you can conduct a rally, however it won't be as good as under regroup. Maneuver gives you 6 movement points. You can't engage, you cannot rally, but you are going to be allowed to use march column, a special movement formation. And finally there's regroup, which is if you're able to pull the unit aside, you're able to rally at greater effect, but you're not going to be allowed to move at all or conduct any kind of combat. All right. So, fire combat. Line of sight is a generally simple thing. Hey, you can see or not see in most games. It's not quite that way in this one. In this one, there's going to be a concept of blocked, of line of sight that blocking terrain and obscuring terrain. And obscuring terrain is just going to give you a penalty on the fire table, which is fitting because you got the cornfield here. If you remember, if you watched my Cedar Mountain from the SPI game, the cornfield provided a penalty there until you shot down the corn, which was always a cool factor in that game. So what's going to happen here is you take a look at the situation between the firing unit and the target unit. And if the firing and target units are in the same level, any intervening hex that's higher than both is blocking. If all intervening hexes are lower than both units, any intervening woods or units will obscure the line of sight. They make it a little harder to fire, that's all. And if any intervening hex is at the same level as both units, the line of sight is blocked if there's any woods or cornfield terrain, or if any unit is in the hex, which is a little bit less, a little bit more painful in terms of the effect of the cornfield. The SPI game assumed, and where are we here? Date-wise, I don't see the date written there, and I kind of don't want to look on the back of this. Well, here we go. 62. No, that doesn't help. The SPI game assumed the corn was still fairly low and didn't have a tremendous complete line of sight block, if I recall correctly. But it was high enough to be a problem. But here it will block, and you can't shoot it down. If the firing unit is lower than the target, any intervening hex that's higher than both units will block. If all intervening hexes are lower than both units, intervening woods or units obscure. And if any intervening hex is at the same level or higher than the firing unit, any intervening woods or unit causes obscured, not blocked here. Remember, the firing unit's the lower here. Now, this is a little different from your normal line of sight, which generally says, hey, if there's blocking terrain closer to the lower unit, it blocks. Instead, here it doesn't matter whether it's close or not, and you know, you're going to get a little bit of maybe visibility that maybe you shouldn't have from that. It's hard to tell, except if you look at specific cases. And then any intervening unit at the same level will block, the same level as the target unit is going to block the higher unit. If any intervening terrain is at the same level as the firing unit or higher than the firing unit and lower than the target, that's the obscured, yeah. Okay. And then there's kind of a reverse for that. If the firing unit is higher than the target unit, just dealing, instead of doing higher and lower, where they could have written it all as one paragraph instead. Line of sight is always obscured if the target unit is located in a woods or cornfield hex. I assume that is if it's not blocked. If a line of sight passes along a hex side, it's affected by the most restrictive of the two hexes. Blocked fire is prohibited. Obscured is going to take a penalty. Overhead fire. You can shoot over the enemy units at further targets, assuming that they don't block, right? Only artillery can fire over friendly units, and only when they're not using canister fire. Yeah, no doubt. Artillery can't fire over friendly or enemy units using canister fire, but they can refuse. They can fire closer range shells than they would normally use, and then they just don't get the canister bonus on the charts. The weapons are going to have a range, which is listed by the weapon type, versus, say, a smoothbore musket will be effective at 1 hex, extreme at 2 hexes, rifled muskets effective at 1, long at 2, and extreme at 3. And then you'll have a multiplier to the strength points of the unit that are firing. The mixed rebel unit fires as if it's rifled artillery. It has its own chart, but essentially it fires as rifled artillery, but has shifts against it, which will come into play here. 50% or MX artillery at long or extreme range. That gives you a shift to the left on the combat table. Normally you can only fire individual units, but firing infantry that are stacked together or in adjacent hexes may add their strength points together in a single total. They must all be from the same brigade, though, to get a fire order. Artillery units in a single hex can add their strength points together in a single fire point total, but they can't add with adjacent units. Weapon ranges are applied individually. And then you add everything together, do universal rounding, and you'll roll on the table. Artillery in angled or woods terrain may not fire at all. When you fire, the players must determine which unit is the lead unit. That'll be using its CR, which is like the quality rating, I don't know, or morale or whatever, for any cohesion test. And it'll normally be the only affected unit. If there's one unit in the hex, it's the lead unit, no shit. If there's multiple, it's the one with the largest printed strength point value in the hex. If there are multiple units with the same strength point value, the owning player gets to choose which one takes the fire. Okay, so what do you do when you fire? You're going to look up the total combat strength points as multiplied by the weapon range. You're going to apply any modifiers from the different situations. So like target in woods, that gives you two against you right away, right? And that's going to get you on a column. Now what happens when you are on a particular column? Well, you roll an 11 to 66 die and you get a value, let's say 36 against a 5 strength point. Well, what this is going to tell you now is the the chance of a test. If you get a dash, the fire has no effect. Otherwise, if the result includes at least one colored box, the lead unit in the target hex may take a cohesion test. If the modified cohesion rating of the lead unit is in the range of a colored box, the unit takes a fire combat cohesion test. The color of the box indicates how bad a test it's going to be. And that ranges from routine, tough, severe. This is the close combat table. Okay. When you take a cohesion test, you roll an 11 to 66, you roll another 2 dice value. The colored die is going to determine whether or not you take any losses to the forces, and the results, like a D will flip the unit over, a D2 will hit 2 units, etc. It's all explained. And then there's a skedaddle result, which might be a retreat, MH, or morale hits, which require you to take a shaken, or if you're already shaken, a disrupted. And if you're already disrupted, I don't remember what happens, but we'll get to that. Converging fire. If you're being fired through more than one hex side in the same phase, step, or event, and at least 2 of those hex sides have at least 1 hex side between them, you've taken converging fire. In order to take advantage of converging fire as the firing player, you have to pre-announce the fire. You don't normally have to do that, but if you want to announce that you're causing converging fire, you do have to, or take advantage of it, you do have to announce it in time. 1 hex side will be the primary hex side, and whatever units fire through that hex side don't get a column shift from it. Any other firing units involved in the converging fire will get a shift for converging fire over here, which is 2 shifts to the right onto a heavier table. All right, movement. During the artillery phase, you can move your artillery and cav. During the brigade's activation, you can move activated infantry that are in attack, defender, maneuver orders according to the movement points that they get. The allowance is specified there. There's a terrain effects chart that tells you how much movement you have to pay for each different type. You can move a stack either as one entity, or you can split them off and use them individually, your choice. Road movement only costs 1 movement point per hex, but the march column rate is when you're using maneuver orders, or if you're moving due to a reserve brigade move event, which is a chit. Or if you're artillery or cav, you only pay a half movement point per hex on the Culpeper Road and Mitchell Station Road connected pike hex sides. Okay, so here's Culpeper, here's Mitchell Station, and I don't know, is pike specified? It says pike looks very much like lane. If you look though, the lane has a little bit of little hash marking on it that the pike doesn't seem to have, I think. But the big thing is, these are the 2 pikes, I guess. Road stacking limit. If you're using the road movement rates, you can only have 8 strength points at any time moving through a hex, unless you're a bigger unit. Which means if you're moving into a hex that would overstack you at any point during that, you're not using road movement anymore. You can overstack temporarily during movement, but the road movement can cause problems. And then, like I said, artillery and woods have a special cost when they have to portage around another unit. You're engaging when you move adjacent to another unit. Some orders will not allow engagement. Engagement does not require close combat. In fact, in some orders like defend, you're not allowed to close combat. Anything but an attack, really, or whatever it is. Okay, whenever you move out of a hex adjacent to 1 or more enemy units, you probably will take disengagement fire. The enemy player can do a fire combat from all adjacent units before the unit moves. And units are halved in their strength points for this kind of fire. The moving unit will be the lead unit in this case. Other units can't be affected other than due to a panic result. If the moving unit suffers a retreat result from this fire, its intended movement is canceled. I assume if multiple units are moving, they can all be affected, and lead unit is chosen amongst them if you wanted to do that. And you can take multiple disengagement fires during one move. Now, if you're doing a retreat move, though, you don't take disengagement fire for the first hex you're leaving. So if you were just shot out of a hex, you don't have to. You don't take the disengagement fire, and that's really similar to the GBACW games. When reinforcements come, they'll all drop in a hex, even if they're overstacked, when they're activated with a full activation. If you end up with only a limited activation, you blow their activation and they don't come on the board. Off-map withdrawals, you can leave the map edge for one movement point. You're out of the game permanently, but you don't count as eliminated. All right. Close combat's similar to fire combat. You're using the same base table here, but your casualty table is different. You'll be using the close combat checks. Now this is interesting because these affect both sides actually. So a close combat cohesion test is always required regardless of the effect on the combat results table. If a no effect is taken, you'll be taking a close fight check, which, but you'll notice here, if I can get the zoom to pause, the ADs are attacker disordered, BD is both disordered, D is going to be the defender disordered, just like it would be under fire combat. So that gives you kind of an idea of what's going to happen there. And likewise over here under the skedaddles, you have effects that happen to the attacker. Or to the defender. And basically if there's an A in place, it affects the attacker. If there's no A in place, it's not going to affect the attacker. It's just going to be the defender. If there's a B in place, it affects both players. You also get these P results, which I didn't explain when I was over here. That's a panic result. That's going to require tests by other units, and we'll hit that when we get to the actual rules on the tests. I've given you most of the rules on that from memory, but I don't really remember how the panic actually works. Okay, so the close combat requires active infantry units under an attack order, or a cav unit during the artillery step, or infantry or cav operating under an event that allows close combat. And some of the events will allow you to attack. Artillery can never close combat. The active player announces every close combat he plans on making and designates all attacking units in the hexes they're attacking. Multiple units can attack together in the hex if they wish. Then we follow the following procedure. The defensive fire. Enemy units in the targeted hex can fire defensive fire. In addition, other enemy units adjacent to the currently attacking units, who are not themselves the target of a different declared close combat, can also issue defensive fire, but they only use 50% of their strength points, supporting defensive fire. This fire will be taken care of normally in any order chosen by the defending player. If any retreat is achieved, or if an attacking unit ends up over here on the broken track, and we'll explain that when we explain some of the results here in more detail, cannot take part in any further in close combat. If there's more than one defending unit in the attacked hex, each defending unit may issue defensive fire at the same attacking hex, or they can fire at different attacking hexes. In lieu of issuing defensive fire, cav may instead withdraw a hex away from the enemy attacking unit, and this has to be a hex the cav could enter, and then the attacker can advance after close combat. There's no limit to the number of times cav can withdraw from different enemy attacks. The cav does not suffer disengagement fire when withdrawing, and it can decide to do defensive fire if it wishes. Okay, the initial column for close combat. Any announced attacking units that did not retreat and were not broken must continue to conduct the close combat, regardless of what happened to other units that were hitting. The attacking player finds the column that includes the total number of SPs of the attacking units, all attacking units in the hex must add their SPs together into one total. Now, we have close combat shifts, though, based on who's outnumbering who. Smoothbore weapons give you a bonus. Your quality gives you a bonus. The defender terrain could give them a bonus. A bunch of artillery, 50% or more of your artillery, of your strength points or artillery, I'll give the defender a big penalty. And the rebel yell event gives, it gives the attacker a bonus. And we also have adjustments based on the cohesion level of the forces. And that'll be, based on the status of the forces. If the unit is shaken or disrupted, it'll take a penalty. What about unsupported? Yeah, we're going to have to look up what that means. Probably means nothing nearby. You look at all those chart effects and take them in play, and then you'll get a cohesion test, but it affects both players, as I mentioned. Now, what about the cohesion rating adjustments? Yeah, well, that just affects your cohesion. I'm trying to see, though, what an unsupported unit is. That's going to come, that's going to come in the cohesion test itself. Okay, so these are when you make your cohesion test, but it also affects your cohesion rating when you're comparing them for here. All right, when you do a cohesion test, I already explained much of the effects. The panic result, though, is in addition to the normal result of the lead unit, one other unit will panic. The firing player selects one enemy unit in the targeted hex or an adjacent hex that has a modified CR of 3 or less. That unit takes the same skedaddle test result as the lead unit. There will be no panic if there's no units that are low enough. And then close combat's a little different, but very similar, except that it affects both players. Okay. Terrain is ignored during retreats. The terrain movement point cost. You have to move by distance. You must finish a number of hexes away from the original target location. And you may end up retreating more hexes to be that far away if you have to run around a unit. You cannot enter a hex with an enemy unit, and you can't enter an impassable hex or cross an impassable hex side. If you can't retreat, you'll be thrown into the broken 3 box. Now this is important because if we look here, we have things like BT, the lead unit makes a break test. When you make a break test, you're going to make a roll and see if you can get equal to or less than your CR. And you can see you get only shaken or disrupted if you're equal to or less than. If you get higher than it, you go to a broken box, broken 1, 2, or 3. And that's going to be how long you're kind of out of play. Those will recover automatically until you get to the available box, at which point you're going to have to actually take an action to rebuild the damaged units. Let's see. Advance after close combat. If the defender retreats, if either side retreats, it looks like the surviving units, no, it's if the defender retreats. It's not worded that way, but it goes to the attacker. The attacker is able to advance into the hex. They don't take disengagement fire when they advance. If the retreat was 2 or more hexes or the unit was broken, the victorious units can advance 2 hexes. And here it doesn't say attacking units, so I don't know. Okay, what about the broken track? So, we don't get the recovery there yet. I was hoping that would be here. Oh, maybe it is. Artillery are never broken, they're just eliminated. Guns are spiked or, just wrecked in some way. Basically, the idea is if you overrun guns in this era, they're out of play. They're not going to be back in the battle. That may not be entirely true at a very small scale. Sometimes guns would be captured and recaptured. But for the most part, very few games are going to cover that in this era. I think it's kind of covered in the close combat. That one die roll might include taking the territory of guns in without time to wreck them. The broken boxes, during the end turn phase, all units in a broken box move down to the next lower number box. Once they're in the available box, they have to stay there until they're rebuilt. Units in the available box are eligible to use a rebuild action. Rebuilt units are immediately removed from the available box and placed on map in an eligible location in their BW box. We didn't see what supporting units do, how units have support yet. Unit support, here it is. If a targeted or close combating unit does not have qualifying unit support, it's unsupported and its CR goes down by 1 whenever it needs to be calculated. Well, thanks. Where's supporting effect? Unit support qualification. Depends on the type of unit. If you're in the woods, you don't have support, period, the end. Nor do you give support to any other units. Infantry is supported if there's at least one non-shaken, non-disrupted infantry from the same brigade stacked with it or adjacent. Artillery is supported if it's stacked with non-shaken, non-disrupted infantry. Cav is always supported. So there you have it, unless it's in the woods. And that would be done. Okay. On to rally. In order to get battle-worn, shaken, or disrupted units back into the fight, you must try to rally them. In order to rally, you must be in the active brigade if you're infantry, or if you're artillery or cav, you must be stacked with or adjacent to any unit belonging to the currently active brigade. You can't do this during the artillery phase, which is when artillery and cav do their other things. They can do this multiple times in a turn, though, if they're kind of mixed in with multiple brigades. The active brigade must be in regroup or defend orders, or using an event chit that allows it. It must be at least 3 hexes away from an enemy unit, or in the available box on the broken track. It must be on its BW side, battle-weary side, and or have a shaken or disrupted marker. To recover, you can do either recovery or rebuilding in a single step, not both. Recovery is going to be, I think, trying to get these off. Rebuilding is going to be to try to unflip your unit from its damaged side, or battle-weary side. Recovery allows you to remove morale hits from a unit. In defend order, you can remove 1 morale hit per unit. In regroup order, you can remove all your morale hits at once. Rebuilding, you're going to have to make a die roll against the unit's modified command rating, including support, but if you're in the available box, you're automatically assumed to have support there, and they don't actually specify that there. If you roll less than or equal to your quality rating, whatever it is, you succeed and you flip over to your fully functional side. If you're greater, you failed and you stay in your current condition. Under a regroup order, you're allowed to rebuild. Under any other order, you may not. Now, if you successfully enter, you have to be 3 hexes from an enemy unit within 3 hexes of another unit of the active brigade. And then there's some special rules to allow you to bring units on that don't have a brigade on the board. An optional rule that I want to use, this one's going to be kind of complicated. If a unit has ever gone to a broken box, it can never come off its BW side, its battle-weary side. And that's going to require some kind of additional marker or writing things down to keep track of, because all you have on the unit itself is full value and battle weary value. And the idea there is if a unit's taken enough losses to ever get into the broken box, it's never going to be a full strength unit again in the game. But you have to be able to still regroup your units that have not made it onto the battle weary side to full effectiveness. All right. In the end of turn phase, if you have any eligible event or CIC chits you're holding, you're allowed to play them, and you alternate there. If you don't play them, you have to throw them out. The Union, I'll get victory points for each victory point hex he holds, and unfortunately those aren't marked on the map. I may have to put some little markers down to indicate where they are. All the activation markers for the brigades are flipped back to their available side so that next turn you'll be able to activate them again. Units move down the broken track. If you're playing with Jackson, Ricketts, and Hill, their activation status gets modified on there using the random events, the random tables for Jackson, Ricketts, and Hill, whatever those are. And then you start your allocation of your events for the next turn, etc., and your brigade activations. Okay, skirmish order at the beginning of the game that we're playing. There's two scenarios, but this is the full big scenario. The other one starts out here and ends here. This one fills the full day. Well, the full evening battle. Skirmish order. Things start out in skirmish order at the beginning of the scenario. If they leave skirmish order, they will nothing will ever be able to take it back. Unfortunately, the skirmish order chits just say skirmish order on both sides. Kind of a wasted opportunity there in terms of being able to prevent, in terms of able to use the full counter mix. They could have used those maybe to create a couple extra shaken markers or something, and maybe we'll use them for that if we need to. Skirmish order units pay only one movement point for each hex entered, regardless of the actual movement point cost of the hex. They cannot use march column movement rate, however. They cannot engage the enemy. It costs 2 movement points at the start of a movement step to come out of skirmish order. The effect of skirmish order is they have some screening effects. An enemy unit that moves adjacent to a skirmish order unit has to pay an extra movement point because of the harassing fire. And after this, the skirmish order unit withdraws a hex away automatically, slowing them down and falling back. Skirmish order is never going to be allowed to advance and engage. I think I mentioned that already. It must withdraw until it gets to a legal hex that's not adjacent to an enemy unit. If there's no such hex available that it can reach, it'll be in the broken 1 box. And this procedure is conducted with each individual adjacent movement by an enemy unit. It happens even if the skirmish order unit is stacked with a non-skirmish order units, and even due to advance after combat or even retreat movement, with no penalties to the movement of the enemy unit. Skirmish order units fire normally. However, they have some special combat shifts. In particular, when skirmish order units are firing, they take a shift against themselves, and when they're fired on, they generate 2 shifts against the firing unit. They can never engage in close combat. They cannot be attacked in close combat either because they always run away. Victory determination, we're going to have to mark these on the board. There's a number of hexes that are worth different points. At the end of the game, these are the Confederate locations. The Confederates get 1 victory point for every strength point anywhere on the broken track at the end of the game, and 1 victory point for each strength point of enemy artillery they destroyed. The Confederate automatically wins the game if he can get any fully, I don't know, FR, whatever the hell that means. It's in the glossary somewhere, but they can't use words. Confederate infantry unit to hex 1300, Cedar Run Church, which is back here. The Union gets 1 victory point for each Confederate SP on the broken track at the end of the game, and 1 for each eliminated strength point of artillery. In addition, they get points for each of these hexes that they hold each turn. And these will be marked with some kind of markers so that I can remember where the hell they are. But they're different values, so they have to be looked up each turn. The West Map Edge hex, ending in XX17. Well, some of them look like they're 18s. Oh, we're 18, yeah. So anything along here, if the Union is on them with an infantry unit during the end turn phase, they get a victory point for those as well. Less valuable than this stuff. The Union player keeps track of his victory points with markers throughout the game. These hexes that have victory points to them are just symbolic. They don't really show any military advantage, but they give you kind of an idea of what areas would be of some importance, and we'll see what they come up with, but it probably won't be just road junctures or anything like that. During the end phase of the final turn, both players calculate their total victory points, and then we see, hey, how well did you do? I'll come back for optional rolls. Okay, so the optional rolls. Stonewall's bad day. The way this is going to work is instead of Jackson just coming in as a reinforcement, and I haven't placed my reinforcements on the map yet, but normally Jackson would come in, I think turn 9, I'm not positive. It was the CIC. Instead, it's going to be somewhat reliant on the Confederates playing their Find General Jackson common events that they can turn all their event chits into. They can only turn them into them at the moment that they draw, that the chit was just drawn. They have to make a decision. Do I want the event, or do I want to spend this to go find Jackson and wake him up? So, during any end turn phase, the Confederate rolls 2 dice and adds them together. He subtracts the number of common event chits that have been assigned to the track. And if the result is less than the current game turn marker, the CIC marker moves up another space, and eventually it gets to a deploy box. And I've got his injured version here too, just to help. Eventually he'll come into the arrive, and he gets dropped into the draw cup for the next turn. Pope's reinforcements. This works in a similar way. You use the Union common event, send a courier to Pope. This is going to try to trigger rickets. No, not the disease. During the end turn phase, the Union rolls 2 dice, adds them together, subtracts the number of common events. If it's less than the current game turn number, the rickets division is moved up the next box. Eventually, it'll make it all the way to the top. In either case, though, the Jackson or the rickets, the chits that are expended on a given turn get thrown back in the cup. They don't sit there as a constant modifier. You can spend them on any given turn. And rickets will show up on Culpeper Road, 1300, which is, I believe, this. And the Union can delay the entry by 1 turn, entering it over on 2400 instead, if he so chooses. If Ricketts comes in on the end turn phase of that turn, after he's actually placed on the board, oh no, I'm sorry, well yeah, his chit goes in the draw cup. He may not actually make it on the board. Roll a die. On a 5 or a 6, Field's Brigade can enter on the following turn. And supposed to get 2 brigades here, right? Field and Stafford. Okay. Stafford's not in the game. Field is kicking around somewhere here. Fields. And he'll be potentially available there. Looks like he gets to roll each turn until Fields actually arrives, and he'll be showing up on the other side of Culpeper Road down here. Then we got some nice designer notes which give mainly a little bit about the battle, about why he chose this battle, and then a little bit about the system. Not really detailed designer notes though, unfortunately. I always like to see a great deal more, but sort of with my knowledge of the Civil War tactical systems that I've seen, I can kind of intuit some of the reasons for some of the decisions that were made here. I'd like to see how they come out and play, so that's why we're doing the playthrough. And we'll start that tomorrow.